This video is to describe how I set up flaps on the MZ-32 radio. The MZ-32, because you can set up phases and you can do various phase trims, it gives you a lot of flexibility for setting up your flaps. So I no longer use a flap switch for my flaps. I typically do everything through the phases, and I'll show you how I do that. So to start out with, we'll go to the menu and go to the function phase set. And we're going to add a couple phases here. First of all, I'll add a plus sign. I'll add a launch phase for takeoff. And then next I'll add in a landing phase for landing. Takeoff will be half flaps and landing will be full flaps. And then I need to add a control for these. So for my launch, I use little stick switches on my radio, so I'll put that one on there for my launch phase. And then my center position will be normal, so my landing will then be the back position on the stick. So now, and I'll add a voice to these so we can hear them when we switch between them. And I usually add a delay, a couple seconds, so the flaps and the gear and things like that don't go slamming the instant I hit the switch. So you can select that as the delay. So the way I have this set up is normally how I do it, which is all the way forward with the switch is launch. That's the first thing I do is launch. Then I come back to the middle position. That's normal for flying around. And then I go to the rear position, which is full flaps or be my landing position. So let's start with launch. And launch phase would be where the flap is in its neutral position. You want the servo to be in its neutral position. So think of flaps as the neutral position as a flap is halfway down or the middle position. Like it would be like an aileron is in its neutral position because the aileron goes up and the aileron goes down. When the flap is half down, it's halfway up to get in the zero flap position and halfway down to get in the full flap position, approximately. That's why the neutral position for a flap is actually in the middle. So for our launch phase, we typically take off with half flaps. And so I'll leave launch phase as a half flap position. That'll be the basically zero trim position where the flap's in its neutral position. The servo's neutral. So I'll leave it there and then leave everything there. And then my phase set to that. Now my flap should be somewhere around half if my servos are set up properly. Now I go to my servo set menu, and at this point I go to my two flaps, which are here, flap and flap 2. And I can now adjust the trim to get them to both be exactly half flaps. I recently set up a model of B25 and the two sets of inboard flaps were connected together mechanically, and I wired together the two outboard flaps electronically, but the way the two linkages were made in the kit, they weren't the same. They had very different geometry between the inboard flaps and the outboard flaps, so they didn't move the same. So I went to the center position. My outboard flaps went down to about 20-ish degrees, was about what I want, but my inboard flaps only went to 15. So to compensate for that, say my inboard flaps were flap 2, I go to my inboard flaps and I go to the trim position. I start everything in the middle position with trim. That's like trimming my ailerons when they're neutral. That's the flap's neutral position. So I go there and I now adjust my trim to say, negative 25, and now both of my flaps, I can use a ruler or I can use a angle protractor that measures the throw, and I can get them to where both my flaps are, we'll just call it 20 degrees, let's say. That's my half flap position. That's what I do. I use my sub trim to get maybe this one's not quite 20, maybe my regular flap isn't quite 20 degrees, and I gotta make that one a little extra, so I add 10 to that one or something like that. And now, okay, I'm now at position where I'm in my launch phase and I have both flaps in their half flat position. Okay, now once that's done, I gotta look at the other two phases. Now I want to use the phase trim. So now I go to phase trim. I don't need to do anything to this one except potentially maybe some elevator trim. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I don't need to do anything with the flap trim on this one because my flaps already, I used the sub trim to dial them into the position that I wanted. Done using sub trim, won't use sub trim again. Now, from now on, we're going to go to the normal. Now our normal position, we will now take the flap trim here, and we're going to, you can see I already have in a negative 30%. We put in some, maybe negative 30, 40%, whatever it takes to get the flaps to come up to their up position. Okay, now here's the part that is actually really useful. maybe when we do that, we put in -45, one of the flaps, like for instance on my bomber, the inboard flaps came up to flush with the rest of the wing, and they're in the perfect position, but now my outboard flaps aren't up all the way. Okay, so what do we do about that? So now we go to the servo set. This time we use the travel adjustment, not the trim, but the travel. So we're going to adjust the travel only for the outboard flaps in their up position. And we'll say, let's say for instance, that's the negative travel side of the flaps. It just depends which way the servo is in, whether that's going to be negative or positive. And so now we'll take the negative side, and I need to increase that a little bit because my flaps didn't come up all the way. So I'm going to increase that to maybe 115. Now my flaps came up in the up position like I needed. And so now when I'm going to close that, now I'm going to go to my servo monitor, and we'll see that here's my takeoff position, which is half flaps. You can see the -25 and the 10 trim that I put in. And now when I go to my normal position, I've got my 2 flaps, my outboard flaps here, which was this on channel 7. They had to go a little farther, right? Because the way the linkage was set up, they have to travel farther. But both flaps now go from the half down position to the up position evenly. So now we just have to do the landing position. So in order to do that, we'll go back to the menu, the function menu. We'll go back to the phase trim menu. Now we're going to go put the switch in the landing position. And now we're probably going to, let's say, the other one was negative to get them to go up. So let's say I had to go positive. We got to put in probably quite a bit of positive, maybe 90%, because now we're trying to get them to go all the way down. We want our flaps to go all the way down. Once again, my 2 flaps may not have gone down evenly. That's okay. We can go back to the base menu, back to the servo set. This time, it's the same one, that flap one that has a different travel and linkage. That one now, it didn't go down all the way as far. So I'll take that one and I'll make it, maybe 120% now, so to get that one to go all the way down. So now both of my flaps go up and down evenly. You notice the percents are not the same because the throw is not the same because the linkages were different. If you don't have that case, the linkages are exactly the same, you don't need to go through that travel adjustment. But this, I'm just showing you this so you can do that if you need to. Normal position where now the flaps are all the way up, and then launch where they come down to the halfway position, and that landing, they go way down in that position to get us all the way down. So that gets us our flaps set up, and they're set up with those phases. And now the only other thing I was going to show you is a very useful thing. Now there's an elevator trim, and this elevator trim right here, this goes with each one of the phases, so you can trim separate for each phase. So I'll just put it on the landing one. Well, I'll put it on the launch actually for this one, and I'm going to select the trim. And now what I can do is I can pick this little box with the red triangle in the corner. That's the direct adjust. Now I can use my direct adjust. This phase, this number 1 is another one that I had for something else. This is number 2. It doesn't have a control set up to it yet, or designated with it yet. So I'm going to take that one. I'm going to select that one, and I'm going to do DT5 right up here. I'm going to click that one so I can select that trim button. Now I have that trim button selected. Say OK. Now when I move that trim switch, you can see the output right down here. You can see the output moving. And that now will adjust my elevator while my flaps are in the half down position, so I can trim it for that position. Every time I change my phase, I can just use that. If I assign them all to the same switch, I can use that same switch to the trim lever switch there. I can use it to adjust the elevator trim for each flap position. Now here's something really important, very important. See how these say -125 to 125? That's a lot. If for some reason you are in like a normal phase where you don't have the direct adjust adjusted to it, and you start fiddling with that trim button, you're not going to notice it because you're not in the phase where that trim is active. But you're still changing the trim, so you don't want to be able to be trimming and trimming and trimming and not realize it until you flip to the phase where the trim is active, and all of a sudden it goes in all at once. So this 125 right here, you want to take that little bugger there and you want to take that down to something like 30% maximum. You don't want to have a whole bunch of trim in there so that you can't, basically it's just keep yourself from getting in trouble accidentally. Same thing with this one, the 125. Take that down to about 30%. That way you cannot give yourself more than 30% trim, which is kind of similar with the trim dials here. That's kind of what they max out around 30% or so, and you can't get yourself into too much trouble. So always, when you're ever using direct adjust, always make sure that you turn those down. Don't leave those at 125%. So that's basically it. The summary of setting up the flaps is set up your phases, start with your launch or your half flat position, sub trim the right throw so your flaps go into the correct takeoff position using the sub trim while you're in the launch mode. Then once you do that, you leave sub trim alone, you're done now. Now you go to the next phase, the normal phase. Use phase trim to adjust the flaps so they're full up. Then go to the landing phase, adjust the phase trim and the flaps so the flaps go full down. And if for any reason they don't go up and down evenly during any of that process, you can go into the servo menu and use the travel for the correct either up or down position, that endpoint travel. You can use that to adjust the throw to get them to go up, one flap to go up, down, whatever you need to get them to stay so they go through the entire range evenly and together. Thanks for watching.